I apologise that Chloe's not with me today, my client, but hopefully I'll put her charts over relatively well. So I guess over the last day and a half, we've heard some really big issues coming out. Quantum theory, futurology, agile working, big data, integration of qual and quant. I'm talking about something relatively small scale in terms of the case study that I'm doing. It's a relatively small scale project, but it helped our client what they achieved, what they saw was a big result. So hopefully you'll find it of some use. And at the heart of the brief that they gave us was the need to understand how to write for millennials. So hold on, let's try that. Okay, so why was this an issue? Well, I'm going to start with a quote from George Bernard Shaw, philosopher and writer, and he wrote originally about the UK and the US. They were two nations divided by a common language. I'm going to deliberately misquote him to say what we were looking at was two generations divided by a common language. And this was effectively an acknowledgement from Johnston Press that millennials are very different from their core customer base. The core customer base of Johnston Press is about 60 years old, so millennials are very different from them in that sense. Different use of technology, different attitudes, different aspirations, different language, and generally just a different persona, different worldview. So how could we help an established company like Johnston Press write for this millennial audience? So very briefly, I'll tell you a little bit about who they are, because they're not very well known as a brand. Then about the opportunity that they saw and the challenges. Finally, I'll get on to what we did and a few little bits of examples of the findings. So who is Johnston Press? Johnston Press is one of the three big local multimedia publishers in the UK. They have something like 200 titles, including 13 daily titles. And the titles range from really big national papers like the Scotsman in Scotland to something called the Lancashire Evening Post, which actually doesn't even cover Lancashire, it just covers a town called Preston. Is anybody from Preston? No, it's a horrible town. So they've got a massive wide reach, and they're also really big in digital nowadays. They've got 195 websites. They cover about 30 million people a month, so they've got something like 9 million people reading print and 22 million read digital. So they've got a massive footprint for a brand that's really not that known. They make their money from cover price and increasing the ad revenue, as you may expect. So what was the opportunity? Well, in 2015, early 2015, they set their teams out. Well, they did a whole review of who was really engaged with localness and community in the 21st century. So they did a major study to try and identify which segments really engaged with localness. They used qual, they used quant, they used economic modelling as well. They also found, their research found that millennials could be quite conventional in some ways, but how they express their values and how they express themselves was much more digitally focused than their other audiences, than their older audiences. They also were aware that they didn't really understand millennials as it was at the moment, but they saw an opportunity there, and they decided, before launching nationally, to do an experiment and launch a new brand which is based on, I guess, local news and entertainment in one market. So they chose Belfast, effectively. They chose Belfast for a number of reasons. One of the big reasons is it has a very high proportion of millennials. About a third of the population of Belfast is millennials, effectively. And also, Belfast is a really vibrant city now. It's a great city. There's lots of development. There's lots of tourism going on there. It's a great place to visit, so I'd urge you to go and have a look at it. Another reason they chose Belfast was because they have a legacy or an established base in Belfast. This is a facsimile from the newsletter, which is one of their brands over there, which has been going since 1737. Started by a guy called Francis Joy, ironically because it's covered things like the potato famine, the Troubles, various wars and so on, but a really well-established brand. So they knew the market, but at the same time this was a challenge because millennials see the newsletter as very much of the old world order. It reminds them of the Troubles, it reminds them of sectarianism. So this was a challenge for them as well. So effectively they needed to understand millennials. They did a lot of research in this area, and because they really did recognise that as a brand, they weren't close to millennials. They didn't have an intrinsic understanding of millennials and how they absorb things. So they did a lot of research. Critical for them was figuring out how to write for millennials. Previous research they'd done had revealed that language and the written word was very important for these guys. So they needed to define a writing style that ensured that their journalists weren't subject to their own biases, effectively, when writing for millennials. They were worried that the journalists would sort of think that you had to write for millennials in a certain way and just go ahead and do that, and it would be horribly wrong. So we really needed to sort of understand exactly how to write for them in a way that would, I guess, encourage engagement rather than inhibit it. And finally, we needed to make sure that the organisation listened and acted. We always had that kind of problem. I think we've had it a few times mentioned over the last couple of days. But the thing about journalists is that they hate research. They're a bit like creatives in ad agencies. Journalists hate being told facts, and they hate being told things. They're really cynical about being told what to do. And they really hate being told how to write by people who aren't journalists. So that was a big block we had to come over there. It's like us being told how to moderate focus groups by management consultants or something like that. So there's a major block we needed to overcome there. So to sort of meet the challenges, we did two things. We needed convincing evidence, and we needed to be able to communicate effectively to the journalists. In terms of what we did, the rationale for our research was based partly on behavioural science and behavioural economic thinking, an acknowledgement of the biases and influences that people have when they're doing things. But specifically, we were really interested in context and frame of reference. So we wanted a methodology which was all about writing and reading and not about verbal communications or visual communications. It had to be centred around text. One, because that was the right context as far as we saw it, but also because that's what journalists really looked to. It hit the journalist frame of reference and it was something that talked to them, and we thought we could get the messages over better if we made the research totally around text. So we did something that was digital to fit the right media. We did something that was written, not spoken. There was no talking in any of the research that we did. And finally, it had to be individual and not group. So what did we do? We did a 3-stage study. First of all, we recruited a millennial panel. It's probably sort of slightly bigging it up, saying a panel. There's 30 people recruited to be at the younger end of the millennial age group, and because it was Belfast, we had an equal mix of Catholic and Protestant in there, so there was no sort of sectarian divide that we took on. We started off with following them on social media, then we asked them to write some pieces for us, and finally we asked them to read some pieces that the journalists had written. So I'm going to go through each one of those in turn and pull out what we did and the benefits and drawbacks of each. I think in terms of following of social media, this was nothing new here. We've all done this kind of stuff. We just followed these guys for about a week each. And we followed them primarily on Twitter and Facebook because that was more text-based as far as we could see. And really, it's just to get an understanding of how they wrote. And these are some examples of their tweets and stuff. I don't think there's much surprising here. You can see use of slang. Someone says out tonight. That's a bit slangy. And boom and screwed and stuff like that, a bit of swearing. Some use of emoticons, as we might have expected. And the only thing this guy wrote for the entire week, Belfast Barman at the top, was, "My rabbit is a dickhead." Still don't know why that happened. So in terms of benefits of this one, I guess, it's what you'd expect from following people on social media effectively. Gave us a great insight and observation of the language that they used. And it really showed this natural, semi-conversational social media style language. And to a degree, it corroborated initially the view that journalists had that there'd be loads of slang and LOLs and all that kind of stuff in terms of what people were doing. And it was really interesting because it gave us a great contrast to the more formal writing that we asked them to do later. In terms of pitfalls, as I said, Belfast Barman tweeted once in the whole week, so we should have just made sure a bit more that we were getting people who were going to be tweeting a lot. Loads of these guys were following and sharing and retweeting, but not doing much primary content. The next thing we did was writing. So this was a writing task that we set them, effectively. We asked each of our panellists to write 2 short pieces of about 500 words each. So this was really interesting for the journalists because they love to see the sorts of stuff that these guys would write. We gave them a list of topics. Topics included things like what I'd put in room 101, so what I really hate, what I want to do when I grow up, last sporting event I went to, last concert I went to, that kind of stuff. 500 words each, and it was an open brief in terms of the style that they used. We just asked them to write as if they were writing for their peers. And it was all online, effectively. Now I'm going to show you an example of a text which someone wrote for the Room 101 theme, and this guy hated cinnamon with a vengeance. It's amazing. I thought it was a really good bit of text. An overwhelming chemical assault masquerading a simple spice. Cinnamon has ruined so many things. This is great. Look, Christmas. Stringing sticks of cinnamon up makes your house smell bad and look like something from the Blair Witch Project. Fantastic. He's probably got the guy in the basement sharpening his knives as well, I'd imagine, reading that one. But, I mean, this was really, the journalists really engaged with this because they could see people writing from the heart, and some of it was actually good enough to actually go in a magazine. You know, it was really interesting. And it was really eye-opening for them because there was, you know, as we were looking through it, we got 60 pieces back, which was a lot of data, which was good. But we got the authentic millennial voices in terms of how they were writing, what they'd like to read. What we also saw was very little use of emoticons or slang or that kind of stuff. You know, it's really actually quite straightforward, normal, in inverted commas, language that these guys were using in structure. So we really got a good picture of their perception of the magazine style. It's interesting to say as well, we hardly had to chase anyone for this panel. They loved what they were doing. They really engaged with it. In terms of pitfalls, oh, God, it took forever to analyse. It was not a nightmare, it was really good and rich, but it took us a lot longer to analyse than we expected, partly because we were looking not just at content, but sentence structure and grammar and that kind of linguistic stuff, which, you know, normally we're looking at content when we analyse stuff rather than that kind of stuff. So it took a long time to analyse, and partly because of that, if we're doing this, define your analysis points in advance, because otherwise it just turns into like reading nice essays. So, you know, we had analysis points like sentence structure, length of sentences, similes, metaphors, use of linguistic devices like rhetoric and so on, use of grammar, word counts, what adjectives they were using for positive, adjectives using for negatives, and so on. So just defining it in advance helps a lot there. And the last thing we did with them was building on the first two stages effectively. So we got the first two stages. We sort of talked with Johnston Press about that, and we sort of decided with them what we thought the best style would be for writing for millennials going forward. And on the back of that, they had some journalists write some pieces. So two journalists wrote in three styles each the same story. So a formal style, a middle ground style, and a very colloquial, slangy style. We thought we knew which one would win, but we wanted to test it out. And we got two journalists to do it to make sure there was no personal styles going on there as well. And each of the guys in the panel commented on 4 pieces each. So I guess this was also a bit more accessing System 2 in terms of what they wanted to see in a magazine, whereas the first one was a bit more just like writing in a natural way. It was online as well, again. So I'll give you a clue in terms of what lost, but the most disliked style was the colloquial style. And this is a bit of an example of a colloquial style which they roundly hated. You know, it was seen as aggressive, because I said, you know, it says here, I swear I could have just kicked him because I really couldn't be bothered with him. You know, it's using cos and it's using convo and Egypt. Too slangy, trying too hard. It's like your dad dancing at a disco. So it really didn't work for these guys. Really turned them off. And again, it's partly because it was done all via text that the journalists accepted it, because it wasn't our, we were interpreting it obviously, but they could see it in black and white and in text. Benefits of this one, well, it built on the previous stages, so it was ready to go at the end of the project. 120 critiques, which is amazing depth of data, I guess, and very detailed responses in terms of what we got back. So they were engaged, and we got a lot out of it. Time taken to analyse is another thing to watch out for, and the other thing is defining the analysis points in advance, same sort of things as the first one. And the only other thing on this one is we couldn't figure out a way to do it, to present it in a very televisual manner. It didn't really lend itself very well to video. Someone sitting down typing didn't really work for us. That could just be our lack of imagination, but that's one of the things if you want to try and push it through an organisation, this style doesn't really work. What happened? I'll share a few results just before we move on to what Johnston Press did with it. Okay, so one of the things we found was that they have a limited vocabulary in terms of how they write. So we counted the adjectives that they use, either positive or negative. Far and away, the most frequently used adjective was great, and the most frequently used adjective for bad stuff was bad, basically great and bad, you know. And then in slang, this was a slang they used. So you could see hardly any slang coming out at all from what they were saying. I mean, brolly and wee is quite sort of Scottish, Northern Irish, but it's not necessarily millennial. You know, it's used by people of normal age, outside the millennial age group. Boom as well was another one, but again, that's not necessarily a millennial piece of slang. It's just widely used in the UK at the moment. Other stuff is just, very small in terms of frequency, I guess, that we're looking at. But the interesting thing here is that the limited vocabulary doesn't mean dumbing down, because we actually found that what they really responded well to was intelligence worn lightly in terms of how the articles were written for them. So they love this quote at the top. Like a superhero on the surface, Botanic Gardens is sensible and ordinary. And that was inclusive, because millennials grow up with superheroes. You had fairy tales, they have superhero stories. So they liked that. It was seen as a bit clever, a bit different, and it was talking to them. They hated this one. Imbibed copious amounts of intoxicating liquor. They said, it's like someone swallowed a dictionary. It's using big words just for the sake of it, and it's showing off. So, the journalists could see how that works, and it enabled them to sort of moderate what they were doing. We were also able to bust quite a few myths for these guys. So, we told them in the magazine, you really don't need emoticons, you don't need to use text abbreviations, you really don't need to swear, and try not to use really slangy phrases like this one. Does anyone know what that means, by the way? Bear out, fam. That means that's rather poor behaviour, my friend. You would hear it said in somewhere like Croydon or Bromley in London. So that's a sort of street slang, which, again, journalists were thinking they were going to have to write like this. But we were able to say, in the format you're doing, leave it well alone, unless you're writing in character, that is. We also identified a winning style for them. The overly colloquial style is like David Brent, it's like your dad dancing at a disco, roundly hated, so avoid that. Actually, the formal style is all right, because if you're transmitting information, it's much better to have something that's neutral and puts information across than to annoy people. But the best one was a middle ground, as we sort of expected, having done the first two stages. And the middle ground meant that journalists could actually write in their own natural style, generally, but just take on board a few rules specifically about writing for millennials. So that worked really well there. I mean, journalists could actually write in a style which was sort of authentic to them. So overall, Johnston Press felt that the project allowed them to write in a way that was authentic and honest. We produced some things for them, like a baker's dozen, we called it, which is slang for 13 in the UK. 13 different rules for them when writing, the journalist should follow when writing, with examples of good and bad practice for each one. That fed into their Millennial Style Guide. And the Millennial Style Guide was something that's published within Johnston Press and tells them not just about how to write, but also tonality and graphics and so on. This is an example from the Style Guide. You can't really read it, but it's got some things that people should be aware of, like, adding in a touch of nostalgia to the stories. These millennials seem to be really into nostalgia. They're often remembering what it was like when they were really young, like 2 years ago when they were 16 or something. So that was coming out. They were getting that from this, not just the things like use metaphors and be grammatically correct. Really avoid being cool, using cool acronyms, don't swear for the sake of it, stuff like that. And this is basically used by every journalist now as a quick aid memoir when they write for this audience, just to sort of stick within these rules. And it's relatively easy to adopt within your own natural style. It fed into workshops, training workshops for the journalists, and actually it's been used throughout the group now when they're trying to expand this kind of publication in other regions as well. And finally, they're using it as a sort of a guide to recruiting journalists. They don't need to recruit millennial journalists as such, just people who are open to this kind of writing. So overall, Johnston Press thought this gave them a very authentic voice for the publication. And in terms of final words, Belfast Vibe launched, I think, in June last year, and it's doing really well. It's making money, which is good for publication in its first year. It's hitting its targets as well. They've exceeded their target for unique browsers by 180%. They've exceeded their target for page impressions by about 100%. The audience is 87% aged between 18 and 44. I know that's beyond the millennials, beyond millennials, but they don't have the right codes to do it properly. And 68% of usage is on mobile phones. So very successful from their point of view. The success was owed to not just this research, but the overall program of the research that they did. And critically, this research was seen to be very important because it enabled them to engage millennials on the page itself. Its legacy, as they said, they think the legacy is an authentic, honest voice that they can write with. And although it's a small project, I'm going to quote big, no legacy is so rich as honesty, as Shakespeare said.